Resident Evil 4 arrived with a host of issues when it launched late last month. Poor image quality, inconsistent performance, ugly screen space reflections, and controller response issues defined the launch version of Capcom's survival horror remake, among other serious problems. The underlying game was definitely a successful effort and did look quite attractive, but it was weighed down by a wide variety of technical issues. Some 2 weeks later, Capcom has put out the game's first post-release patch. Update 1.004 introduces a version of the Mercenaries, Resident Evil's time attack action game mode, alongside apparent fixes for some of the game's most pressing issues. So have Resident Evil 4's most substantial problems been addressed? And what still needs to be fixed? I was pretty frustrated with the state of Resident Evil 4 on release. Most of the issues from prior Resident Evil titles were back in full force, alongside a ton of new problems, many of them slightly bizarre and totally unexpected, that made the game feel sort of unpolished. The most obvious immediate issue came down to image quality. All console platforms suffered from a noisy, messy image resolve, with PS5 affected by what looked like additional reconstruction issues on top of that. Patch 1.004 does make changes in this area, but the final results are pretty mixed. On the plus side, the PS5's specific issues with image construction seem to have been addressed to some degree. The game looks sharper and more detailed, with similar levels of artifacting but with a more precise look. It's not perfect, but it is an improvement for sure. Measured up against Series X, the two versions of Resident Evil 4 now look very similar, which is what you would expect. But there is a pretty big caveat here. The Series X version of the game looks worse relative to the launch release, with a sharper appearance but substantially more aliasing. Likewise for Series S, which also suffers from excessive edge artifacting. The anti-aliasing just doesn't seem to be working very well as of the most recent update. And that holds true across all current-gen consoles. It's just that the PS5's specific reconstruction issues seem to have been fixed too. All the resolutions appear to be the same as the launch release, with a 1080p 1440p split on Series S, an 1800p 2160p split on Series X, and a 1944p 2160p split on PS5. So this all comes down to differences in image treatment between patch 1.002 and 1.004. I think Capcom should really reconsider their approach here. Resident Evil Village had a cleaner image on consoles, while also featuring a fairly foliage-rich world. Perhaps a move towards a less aggressive checkerboard solution or a native resolution approach with a lower pixel count would suit this title more. I would much prefer a softer but more temporally stable final image, particularly given how dark and low contrast Resident Evil 4 tends to be. As a final note here, the PS5's lens distortion and lens distortion with chromatic aberration options now render correctly, without the smeary low-resolution look that they had before. I'd still recommend turning these off, but at least image quality isn't ruined if you stick with the defaults. The footage in this video has been captured with these options off to better showcase Resident Evil 4's underlying image quality. At launch, Resident Evil 4 suffered from issues with reflections, with low-res RT reflections, and a very poor SSR implementation. These problems were carried over from prior RE engine efforts, with little improvement over the past few Resident Evil titles. I can report some good news in this front, though again there are some caveats. On PS5 and Series X, the screen space reflections have been completely eliminated as far as I can tell. Regardless of the rendering mode, these low-quality artifact-ridden reflections are totally absent, replaced by cube maps or RT reflections, depending on the circumstance and the toggled visual settings. In some sense, this is a settings downgrade, but it's definitely a net improvement to my eyes. On Series S, the screen space reflections mostly seem to be eliminated, but on one reload they did reappear for some reason in the frame rate mode. Partly because of that, it's hard to tell if this is an intentional change or an unwanted side effect of changes elsewhere, but I'm hoping the screen space reflections are gone for good. The ray traced reflections do seem about the same as before, with a similar quality level. PS5 and Series X mostly equip themselves well enough, although the BVH structure isn't drawn out too far, so you can spot some odd looking reflections in a few spots, specifically when viewing certain water surfaces from a distance. Series S still suffers from blocky looking reflections that show obvious scaling artifacts, which is probably a byproduct of the reduced resolution on that console. Again, Series S doesn't have an explicit ray tracing toggle, but RT reflections are forced on in the resolution mode. Resident Evil 4 wasn't a very well-behaved title from a performance perspective when we took a look at the launch version. Most of the mode combinations ran unlocked, with PS5 and Series X holding 60 more regularly in their lowest end configurations, and Series S essentially ran uniformly poorer than either premium machine. There have been some substantial improvements on this front as of the latest patch. If we take a look at matching shots here on Series X, the current version is operating with a 5 to 10 FPS advantage over the launch code. Every permutation of options that does drop frames simply runs significantly faster, which means the game is going to feel more fluid and hit a full 60 FPS more often. In the default framerate mode, Series X now consistently operates at 60 FPS. Across a variety of stress tests, the game plays back at a smooth 60, without any dips at all, which is a big improvement from the 50 to 60 FPS run of play in the launch code. Even in the most taxing early game scene, we're still hugging 60. The resolution mode plays pretty similarly to the framerate mode at launch, bottoming out around 50 FPS, with most gameplay at or near 60. And if we turn everything on, we get a pretty unstable turnout that spans 40 to 60 FPS, depending on scene complexity. Series S also runs considerably better here than in its initial form. The framerate mode is close to a locked 60 FPS, even during heavy combat. The rainy sequence at the outset of Chapter 5 does cause some extended dips, but other challenging segments run without issue. Resolution mode bottoms out in the mid-30s with a pretty awkward response, though remember that this mode on Series S also includes ray trace reflections. The outcomes on PS5 are a bit less clear. The framerate mode is pretty close to a locked 60 FPS here, with no real issues in these early segments, but this is similar to what I observed on the launch patch. The resolution mode still hangs in the low to mid-50s when heavily taxed, and the all-dressed option often runs in the mid-40s. It's certainly possible that the PS5 has some performance improvement here, but if so, it's a more minor boost than the series consoles have received. The dead zone issues on Xbox Series consoles have also been alleviated. At launch, Resident Evil 4 on Xbox had a massive dead zone, and players had to deflect the sticks about 40% through their range of motion to get an on-screen response. As of the latest patch, the necessary deflection angle is much more restrained. Other Xbox Series action games, like Resident Evil 2 and Dead Space, take about as much deflection before you get an on-screen response, so this feels pretty appropriate for the controller, and the game has much improved playability now. Resident Evil titles stretching back all the way to the original Resident Evil 3 have often featured a minigame called the Mercenaries. This mode essentially takes areas from the campaign, fills them with challenging enemies, and puts a time limit on the proceedings. Killing enemies and picking up power-ups can extend the time limit, so the mode is really oriented around defeating as many enemies as quickly as you can and moving around the map to pick up time extensions. Resident Evil 4's sped-up mechanics suit this mode quite well, and I did enjoy my time with it. The amount of content is pretty limited though, with just 3 small maps at the moment. I also found the gameplay to be a little bit too easy, as A and S ranks are pretty breezy to achieve. Hopefully Capcom will expand and tweak these offerings over time. Performance in the Mercenaries basically matches the more intense combat areas in the main game, so I'd advise sticking to the higher performance options here. The default framerate modes run with a pretty solid lock on 60 FPS on all 3 consoles. Curiously, the option for hair strands seems to be completely disabled here, so it can't be turned on at all in the Mercenaries. Resident Evil 4 is substantially improved from the launch release, but there are a number of areas that could still use some attention. The strand-based hair, for instance, still has a matte appearance and often looks very bright for some reason, which ultimately makes it look worse in my opinion than the default card-based hair. The ray tracing is fairly limited and low resolution, with an especially chunky look on Series S. The game offers a slightly overwhelming array of visual options, and navigating them on the premium consoles can be confusing. Even the areas that have been touched up here still aren't ideal. The performance boosts on Xbox are appreciated, but most of the options continue to drop frames, and an option to lock the game to 30 FPS would give a more consistent refresh for those that don't have VRR displays. And Capcom has shaken up image quality a bit on all current-gen consoles, with a genuine improvement on PS5. But the final image is oddly artifact-ridden. A softer, more stable look would suit the artwork better. With that said, the game has been enhanced over the launch patch, and many key issues have been at least partially addressed. The Xbox platforms in particular are in a much improved state, with a reasonably tight dead zone that translates to pretty decent controller response during gameplay. Resident Evil 4 is an attractive and accomplished action game. While issues remain, patch 1.004 brings all current-gen console versions of the game into a reasonable enough state. If you enjoyed this video, please like, subscribe, and press the bell for YouTube notifications. Check out the Patreon at digitalfoundry.net for exclusive and early access content. And to get in touch, just use Twitter. Thanks for watching.